Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Sheckman, and I'm the Regional Director with Robert Half based in Vancouver. And I have the honor of leading our fantastic teams right across British Columbia and Manitoba who connect talented professionals to inspiring careers with great companies. I want to thank you for joining our discussion today. This topic specifically is incredibly important to me as an individual and a business leader in our community. And I have the responsibility to drive change and really play an active role in pushing for equity for underrepresented groups. I've learned, and more importantly, I continue to learn from people around, including our very own Black Employee Network group at Robert Half, which was formed a couple of years ago. Ben has really inspired me to never sit in the sidelines when it comes to driving equity. I really want to thank you for joining today's discussion. And I'm really thrilled to be hosting and have the opportunity to sing along three incredible leaders in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Today, we've come together to discuss DEI in the workplace with the goal of better understanding its evolution and increasing the importance, particularly over the past few years. We know that no two companies are the same, and there are no one-size-fits-all when it comes to integrating a purposeful diversity and inclusion strategy. Now, through our conversation today, we're focused on exploring tangible advice and best practices for businesses looking to integrate DEI strategies into their culture, and for individuals who want to entice meaningful change within their organization. Before we begin, as always, I want to address a couple housekeeping items. We will be recording today's webinar, and it will be available for on-demand viewing after today's discussion. I will follow up with an email over the next couple of days with the link of the recording, which will be shared post-event. Today, we're going to have the Q&A box open throughout the discussion, so I really encourage you to ask questions and engage with our panelists in real time. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists, and today we're joined by Giselle Blackman, who's the head of human resources at Connor Clark and Lunn Financial Group. We also have Stephanie Redivo, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Leader at TransLink, and our very own Alfredo Mendez, who's the VP of Employee Experience and Inclusion at Robert Half. I want to start off by turning things over to the three of you, and could you each maybe give us a brief self-introduction, perhaps describing a bit about you, your role, and how you actually got into the DEI space. And maybe Giselle, I'm going to pass the mic over to you first, and then you can hand it off to Stephanie and Al from there.
Okay, super. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the panel discussion. Giselle Blackman. I'm firstly a mother, a wife, a friend, an advocate. I would say I'm a leader. I'm also a mentor and a student. With all of those different roles and responsibilities, I see myself as someone who, as part of, as I head the Connor Clark and Lunn, I'm the head of human resources at Connor Clark and Lunn. And in doing so, my role with D&I has been a very, it's a new journey for me. I actually started probably a few years ago, I started stumbling into D&I issues, advocating for, creating spaces for people to be heard and seen. However, it was only when I started at CCNL about 2 years ago that I got the chance to actually start being a part of developing policy as part of a strategic group and developing, designing, and implementing policy. So that's kind of where the journey started for me many years ago as part of my HR career, but more formally within the last 2 years. What about you, Stephanie?
Yeah, thanks so much, Giselle. Steph Redivo, pronouns she, her, and hers. And I do want to just take a moment. I'm based in Vancouver, so I have the honor to live, work, and play on the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. The land acknowledgement is important to me because it's one piece of truth and reconciliation. So I just want to share that. Yeah, gosh, my journey. So I'm the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Lead at TransLink, and TransLink, for those that might not be aware, is our transportation network in Vancouver. We have 8,000 employees, and I'm their first lead who came in July of 2020. You know, Giselle, you did such a lovely, as being a mom and a mentor. I'm also a mom. I'm married to a Filipino man. I identify as white. I have a mixed race daughter. And all of those different components sort of come into play in this space. I got started in the D&I space, is what we called it at SAP, previous to this role, where I was focused on different initiatives. But we'll share more as we go through the conversation. Alf, I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you. It's such a privilege to be with you all today and to have this conversation. So Alf Mendez, pronouns he, him, his. I am the Vice President of Experience and Inclusion at Robert Half. And this role is incredibly meaningful for me as a gay Hispanic man who doesn't necessarily see himself in a lot of leadership teams and at the table a lot when we look at identity and intersectionality. We've been on a journey at Robert Half to really create a culture of belonging and to really create this environment where our employees can connect, thrive, and grow. And so our big objective, and really kind of my big scope, is to really look at how we make DEI the common thread across our organization so that this really becomes an imperative strategic aspect of our business. It's the way that we do work, and it's not an add-on to our job, but it really is something that is truly integrated and truly shows up in the way that we do our traditional day jobs in that respect. So happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion today.
I love that, Alf. I think that's critical. I think it has to be weaved as part of our DNA. Let's loop back, and I think the first question is for everybody in the panel. What do you feel has been your greatest challenge in overcoming as a person? And how has that informed your DEI journey? So maybe we'll start with Giselle, and maybe we can kind of pass it on to the rest of the group.
Okay, thank you. Mike, that's a tough one for me because part of I actually immigrated here in the early 90s, and it was to go to school. I grew up in Trinidad, where a lot of the culture is very diverse. So I didn't have a sense of Blackness until I moved to Canada. So for me, the journey has been not one of identifying, like I didn't understand what it meant to be an American Black, a Canadian Black, and I didn't even understand what it meant to be a Caribbean Black, but I understood the immigrant experience. Through that experience, going to school out here, I had situations where people were saying to me, I can't understand you, pardon me, your accent. I even had a gentleman phone in to my supervisor one time, and I couldn't understand her because of her accent. So as a consequence to that, I actually learned to intonate differently. I studied languages from a very young age. So intonating differently was a way to blend in and to fit in so that I didn't stand out. That was the biggest challenge for me. And that was, I think, the first time when I started to realize that I was smoothing my edges to be a part of. And it took a while before I got to a place where I could actually feel that I could express myself, or I even had a space that I could express myself. The role of HR, I stumbled into it. It was something that I really enjoy. It was something I did naturally, and getting trained in HR was something that helped inform how I approach my experience. However, I think the thing that was the most informative for me was I wanted to create a space where people could be heard. I wanted to create space where people felt comfortable to be themselves. Many times in working in offices in Canada, I didn't see a lot of people that looked like me as managers, as senior leaders. So part of my struggle was, how do I create a space for people where I don't even see a space for myself? So that was where, those are some of the challenges that I faced. And I think having to discover what Blackness meant, having to discover as an immigrant female person who was trying to figure out what my Black identity needs to be, that definition was a process that it took a lot of iterations. And I think the waking up moment for me was perhaps 2 years ago with not Rodney King, was with, my mind's gone blank right now, a couple years ago when George Floyd. And with that experience, I was angry, I was upset, there were so many mixed emotions, and I didn't understand what that was. I couldn't really understand how to bring all those feelings together and do something about it. So what I started with was I started to read. I started to reach out to my network. I started to talk to people to find out, okay, what can I do with all of these emotions? How do I channel them? And that was how I started. But the challenge was trying to figure out, who am I? What do I want to represent? And how do I show up and represent in a way that gives others the space to be represented and to feel represented? So those are just some of the things I went through. I mean, there's a whole list. If we had hours, I can speak about, but that's just a bit of an overview for you. Maybe I'll go over to you, to Alfred.
Sure. So, so similar to Giselle, right? My DEI journey has definitely been rooted in identity and in really trying to figure out who I am and kind of the diverse voice that I bring to the table as well. In the first half of my career, probably the first 8 years of my career, I was actually more focused in the IT space, and in particular implementing large systems like SAP around the world. And so I actually spent 8 years of my career living and working in 20 different countries around the world. And what that experience taught me was I'd been used to being in the majority, of being able to understand language, of being able to understand cultural nuances, of being able to have a sense of familiarity. And then I was putting myself in these situations where I was completely the minority, where I didn't understand the culture, where I wasn't unsure of how I fit into the overall equation, where I didn't understand the language, right? And you know, that sense of unfamiliarity really kind of ignited this passion in really thinking about how do we ensure that everybody has that sense of belonging and that we have this opportunity for everyone, regardless of background, regardless of circumstance, to be able to bring in their full perspective. And so that led me to roles in the HR space, really being able to reinvent the DEI space, to take organizations that had already been doing this work and to elevate that work and to make it more strategic. And I think, you know, one of the things that I think we can all agree on is that DEI work is very personal and very emotional, and it's very difficult to understand the importance of this work if you yourself don't have that personal connection. And I think that's been one of the great privileges of my journey is, you know, obviously being able to leverage my own experience and my own understanding and perception of the world, but to really be able to use that as a basis for conversation with other people that are looking to have their own connection and to have that moment as well. And I think that's where the learning really happens, and the opportunity for us to really drive this work together really magnifies itself as well. So Steph, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah. So for me, back in 2000, I'm going to date myself here. I started off my very first job as a software developer. Well, besides Starbucks, because I feel like everybody had a job at Starbucks at some point. But I was a software developer and working in Seattle, and I didn't really think anything of it until I constantly got the you're a developer, you know, and it was this subtle nuance of the you're a developer, almost to the point that I was like, well, what do you mean? Yeah, I'm a developer. Again, not even sort of thinking about it. So, you know, realizing that I started to look around and say, wow, I'm the only developer in this organization. I did it for a year. I was not, you know, I realized that was not my path to be a developer, but it did make me, you know, want to stay in tech. And to then sort of what happened actually in, gosh, it was now, you know, 2012, SAP made this big announcement. We're going to have a certain percentages of women in leadership. And at that time, I didn't see a lot of women. And so I went on this journey around saying, we need to reach out to girls younger. And so I started something called Girl Smarts for Tech with our local university, where we had a one-day workshop. And I think, as you know, Alf and Giselle, as you said, sort of personal, I had a daughter. And so I wanted to make sure that she had an opportunity to go into tech. And so that's really sort of how it kind of started. And then, you know, SAP being such a large organization, I was able to kind of move into our global diversity and inclusion office. The other little story I will say, throughout, you know, I think this work, we know managers really make it or break it, right? Whether you have a good experience, whether you have an inclusive manager. And late in my career, unfortunately, I went through a toxic boss that, that I actually went out on stress leave. And that was a really sort of awakening of, I don't want anybody else to go through this. And the sort of the spiral of, if I just work harder, or I just change this, or if I just change my behavior, things will work out. And it didn't. So that kind of psychological safety and making sure that people feel that they're safe in their environment is so important to me.
Yeah, no, the belonging is so key, Steph. We're gonna bounce back to Giselle, and I think that something that triggered for me as well, as we discussed, is the murder of George Floyd, and the conversation around DEI has become much more prominent over the last couple of years. Can you maybe offer a little bit of an insight to why you've seen that being the case, and why should companies actually prioritize this topic?
Oh boy, you know what, for a lot of organizations, I think George Floyd may have been a turning point. It was an awakening for a lot of folks. However, I think the bigger umbrella was COVID, or is COVID, because I'm not sure we're fully out of it yet. A lot of employees had time to rethink, reevaluate, and to really reassess what it is they want, whether it is, do they want to be in an office space or not, or do they want to have hybrid work? And that whole rethinking that occurred, many were thinking would lead to the Great Resignation, and a lot of people changing jobs and stuff. But what I saw happening was a lot of folks started looking at, where do I fit in? Do I see my values reflected in the place where I sit as an organization? Do I see myself having a career future? Do my values align with the organization? And is there an effort by the organization to see me? Because in some instances, you may have just been putting your head down doing the work, not realizing that, wait a second, I've been invisible. So I think COVID was a big shift for a lot of folks to sort of reassess. And for organizations, I think all of a sudden we saw this shift where the employees became a lot more aware. Candidates now were in the driver's seat. I mean, we started to have a shortage of talent. The talent pool kind of shrunk because we weren't able to have a lot of immigration and stuff. So what was happening is employees now became the drivers. The conversations, even in interviews, started changing. When people started asking about culture, they were not asking, well, tell me about your culture. They were saying, tell me about your culture, specifically about what you do in the E&I space. Those conversations started to throw employers in a bit of a, wait a second, not doing anything. And then they were finding that they were ill-equipped to respond to and even attract folks who had that interest. The other thing too that I found is that employees started challenging their work environments to do more. It's like, okay, well, we say we're doing this, we're checking off all these boxes on RFPs. What else are we doing? Much more can we do? And I think we were being challenged as organizations to step up and not just check the box, but to actually step into the space, create the space, and create meaningful programs that would actually be sustainable. So I think some of those things really helped, but the shifting of power from the employer to the employee, where all of a sudden the employee was asking the tougher questions and almost demanding that, you know what, for you to retain me and engage me, we need to start doing things differently. Now, it's not an easy process, and a lot of employees find that in going through that, they have to really find a champion. And those champions can be, definitely would need to be at the executive level, but it doesn't have to be a lot of people. It can be just one individual who is like-minded or who wants to create the space, even for the discussion. And I find that some of those discussions are starting to happen. Employers are now asking, okay, how do I get ready? Like, what do I need to do? And for some of us, we didn't even know where to start. So we actually worked with, looked to partnerships with folks external to our organization to help us figure out, where are we in our DEI journey? How do we get prepared? How do we answer the questions employees are asking? We don't even know where we are. One of the companies that we partnered with was Inclusive Excellence. And Alden Abacon was someone who came into our organization and really helped our leadership kind of figure out, okay, where are we in our journey? And each of them realized, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm actually on step 2. I'm doing better than I thought. And others were like, I thought I was doing really badly, but I'm actually on step 5. So I think that recalibration was a good starting point for us because we didn't have all the answers. We didn't even know where to start sometimes. So I think for a lot of firms, maybe it's George Floyd, but I think it was bigger. It was COVID that really had the great reset for a lot of employees starting to ask the question, what are you doing for me? And how do you create engagement so that I can continue to perform at my best and still have a space to be my best? So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Steph?
Do you know what? I totally agree. And I think this sort of the organizations that were very much an in-person, they're sort of held on to a bit of this belief or assumption that, oh, we can't work from home, right? But then, of course, with COVID, you saw you were able to. What I will say, though, is, so as a transit agency, our bus operators and our SkyTrain attendants, they didn't get to go home. So those are the folks that I constantly think of. You know, back in those early days with COVID, things were changing so quickly. We never knew how you were going to get COVID, right? Like, we didn't have masks until months later. So I actually really I constantly worried and thought about our frontline staff as they were out in the public for their psychological health and safety, because it's those frontline workers that were trying to figure things out, and the companies were trying to help as much as they can, but you're on the road 10, 12 hours by yourself. So, yeah.
There's so much, so many good points in there. And I think that you're both bang on that the pandemic has allowed individuals to really reflect and intentionally look and ensure that people's values do align with the organization, and that reset does allow people to understand whether they can move forward and make sure that there's a lot of intentional actions that are taking place. So thank you both for that. The next question is a bit of a two-parted question, and maybe Alf, I'll start with you on this one. How do you feel the DEI space has actually evolved? If we move that needle over the last few years, and can you maybe share your greatest obstacles that you personally had to overcome to better integrate the DEI space within a workplace?
Well, I certainly think that Giselle kind of laid out a lot of the change that we've seen in this space, right?
Yeah.
Certainly social unrest and social injustice coupled with a pandemic has definitely accelerated this. But I think there's also a generational issue that is becoming much more prevalent as we look at this notion of attracting talent, right? It used to be that people would join organizations because of pay and benefits and compensation and more of those harder aspects. And now employees really care more about DEI. They care about corporate social responsibility. They care more about the social ethics of organizations. And that is becoming a significant driver in why people join and stay at organizations. And so I think there's a mentality shift that we as leaders need to really take on around. This isn't just a fun thing to do or a social event to plan. This is a strategic component that is really going to help us attract and retain the best and brightest talent that we're looking to retain and attract as well. When we look at obstacles, I certainly believe, and I think that Steph and Giselle would certainly be in alignment with me on this one, there's still a lot of resistance to the DEI work because leaders don't understand the value of it. I think DEI is one of those areas that constantly gets asked to demonstrate its return on the investment and to really be able to look at, give me the hard metrics around all of this. But I think we've all seen by now, every single study that has been done by McKinsey, by Bain, by BCG, by you name whichever think tank, they all tell us the same thing. Diverse teams outperform their peers. They have stronger financial performance. They are more innovative. They drive an increase in shareholder value. So we need to move ourselves away from the build the business case for DEI and really now move into this aspect of what is it that DEI is going to do to help advance the business strategy? And so that's really the big challenge that we've needed to overcome. And this has been something that has really influenced our work at Robert Half. It's about meeting the organization where it is and really understanding, if DEI is going to be a competitive advantage for us, what are the entry points to this? Because it's very easy for us in this space to go and get distracted by all of the shiny objects that come into play, right?
Yes.
Oh, here comes unconscious bias training. Oh, here come ERGs. Oh, here comes this and that. The problem with that is, in absence of a strategic overlay with it, it becomes flavor of the month. And so then you are really in this space of, I am ticking the box to do this activity, but I'm not really thinking about the long-term sustained change. So the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, what's the end game with what we're trying to do? Are we trying to increase representation? Are we trying to build leadership pipelines that are more diverse from a representation standpoint? Are we trying to build a better brand externally to better attract candidates? Are we just trying to create a culture where people feel like they can bring themselves to work and actually be authentic in that respect? And then understanding that aspect, then really being able to say, okay, here's how we go ahead and start to build. But the final challenge that I would speak to, and then Steph, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. I think that a lot of times our leaders think that we're going to wave a magic wand and that all of these problems are going to be solved overnight. And all of us know that DEI is a long game. One of the things that I constantly tell my leaders is we are in the first inning of a 9-inning baseball game, if baseball is your sport, right? Like, we've just barely shown up. There's a lot more work that we need to do. And I think setting that expectation and being intentionally clear on, in order to enact long-term change, it's going to take you a long time to do. That's the best expectation that we really need to set ourselves up for, in order to make sure that this gets integrated and that this really becomes part of the overall DNA. But Steph, I'm going to hand it over to you because I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one as well.
Yeah, do you know what? I feel like I'm the person in our team that I'm always constantly like, it really hasn't changed. Like, we're still, I mean, people are discussing ERGs, employee resource groups, as this new fancy thing. They've been around since the 1960s. Sorry to ruin the plot here. But I also think it is part of my job to be pushing or pushing the organization. So that's why some ways I'm always unsatisfied, because I can see the ninth inning, right? And so, yeah, I feel like, you know, the fundamental things around education and whatnot, and we'll discuss, are always there, right? Like, looking at your recruiting practices, what are you doing to retain people? That will never change. There may be nuances around it. I think Alfie talked about the whole unrest and the social media, like the social media around DEI is very polarized, and it gets people really excited or really mad. And there is a bit of value in that, you know, but again, you have to take it with, you know, you have to do some fact checking and thinking about that, or else, you know, you see this heightened sense of this is absolutely bad, or we have to absolutely do this. For me, one big obstacle, I will say, when I came into TransLink is there was no roadmap. It was, so like, on one hand, it sounds wonderful, but the breadth of work, I could have gone in so many different places. And Giselle, we also brought in inclusive excellence to do some of our education and whatnot, to kind of get us started. And that's what I'd say, sort of like, if you're looking for that starting point, start with education. And notice I don't say training. Our expectations of training to save us all and make us the most inclusive person is ridiculous. It's an $8 billion and going higher industry we've bought into. But yeah, I don't know, Giselle, is there something else that you want to, I'm sure you've got an opinion or something else to add in for sure.
Absolutely. I think, you know, you guys have hit it on the head so well. The fact that it takes more than just checking the box that you've done this. There needs to be a strategy. And I find sometimes, I like the idea of flavor of the month and dispelling that, because there's so much noise, and so many companies and so many executives think that, well, it has to look like this and it has to look like that. Part of it is that you have to figure out, who are you as a company? What do you stand for? What are you trying to achieve through D&I? Because there is so much to be achieved. There's so many different facets, but you can't be everything to everyone. So pick the few things that you can actually do them well, and not just check the box on the surface, but take them deep. And unfortunately, because there is so much politicization of race and politicization of LGBTQ issues. It's hard sometimes to untangle the differences in a way that we all see. Where we start is that we're all human beings. We're all people who just want to do the best that we can. We want to come to work, make a contribution, fulfill a purpose or whatever it is we're trying to fulfill, and then feel good about it. But I think that is so often lost by people focusing on the things that are external and all the noise in social media about what DEI is or isn't. So I think for organizations wanting to do this well, come up with a strategy, define who are you, what are you about, what are you trying to achieve? Maybe the easiest thing for you to do to start with would be, how do you get more women into your organization or into your industry? Maybe that's where you start. But you can't be everything to everyone. There's always going to be someone who doesn't like what you're doing. But if you're clear on your strategy, folks will understand, okay, this is what the organization is trying to do. I'm not going to ask and throw all these other things at them, but I'm going to see it through to help them achieve this objective. But I think sometimes what doesn't happen, the objective isn't clear.
Yeah, and Giselle, if I could just add one more thing here, because I think you just really illustrated something that I think is so important, which is this idea of who are you as a company and what do you stand for, right? And that aspect in particular, and there's a comment that came through in the chat around, you know, yes, we talk about DEI being strategic and about having these tangible outcomes, but at its core, it's the morally correct thing to do, right? We do this because we are all human beings. And so one of the things that we did at Robert Half when I joined is we created our DEI philosophy, which was basically, why are we even doing this work? And at the core of the DEI philosophy is we as a company believe this is the right thing to do. End statement, right? We, from a humanistic approach, we know that this is the right thing to do. If we get added benefit, if we increase representation, if we do all of these other things, that to us is the icing on the cake. But at its core, it really is about, this is who we are as a company. Here's how our values come into play. And now this helps guide our work and takes us into the various directions of the outcomes as well. So I think that point is absolutely critical. And I think is a point that people tend to forget more often than not, because it feels soft and squishy and nobody really knows how to approach it accordingly.
Yeah.
I love that, Alf. And Giselle, I think that finding your identity as an organization is bang on. I think that's it all starts there. Giselle, I'm gonna stay with you for a second. With you know, we know that change is not easy for organizations. You know, there's a lot of institutions out there that have been doing the same thing for many years. So what advice would you actually offer employees who want to foster a more diverse and inclusive environment, but maybe are getting that pushback from leadership and they don't want to give up and move on? How do you make sure that an employee is feeling empowered to maybe challenge a status quo without maybe pushing the envelope too far? How do you balance that?
Great question, Mike. I've had a few instances myself where I've actually pushed the envelope too far and it imploded. So I can speak from experience of things that failed. But as an employee, I would say that start with yourself. Don't try to fix anything outside of yourself. Try to educate, learn as much as you can about the different aspects of DE&I and what do you understand as DE&I and what are you passionate about? Because if you start there, I think you'll start to discover, okay, I'm more interested in LGBTQ issues, or I'm more interested in issues that affect BIPOC groups or Indigenous groups or whatever. So once you identify what your passion is, then look to organizations that are doing it in the space out there. Use your social media platforms. There's so much chatter and there's so many groups out there that talk about DE&I issues. And there are associations out there that specialize in managing DEI programs in the community. So maybe that's where you start. And through that education process, then you could come back with an informed opinion about what you'd like to help the organization do. Because sometimes when folks hear DE&I, they're like, ooh, you know, that sounds too big, because you haven't been able to crystallize it in a way that it's a bite-sized chunk for the organization. So if you understand what it is you're trying to achieve, then you can go back and see who are like-minded people in your organization. Say, okay, how many of the people care about women in the workplace? Let's start an ERG, which is an employee resource group. Let's just have conversations about issues that women face in the workplace. And let's start having a lunch and learn, just talking about it and creating space to chat. And the more you get momentum through some of these groups, is then you'll be able to get a bit of a push from this group to say to the executive, hey, we started off with 3 people. We now have 20 people that are part of this group. And we'd like to open up a lunch and learn for everyone to talk about, have a panel discussion about women's issues, maybe targeted around International Women's Day on March 8th. That's something that you can start tying in some of the things that you're passionate about to events that are happening in community. If it's an LGBTQ issue, then you can bring it in and say, okay, Pride Month, let's actually have some discussions about how do we create space for folks to be able to express themselves within the workplace. So it doesn't always have to be a big pie in the sky idea. It could be something small, but you need to start with educating yourself first. I think the other thing that is going to be critical for employees is you're going to need to find an executive who can support and champion, because sometimes pushing from the bottom is really, really hard. If you have an executive or someone in a senior role who can be an advocate, who can help you navigate even just how to go about getting funding for your first ERG, or even to get who's going to supply the lunch for this lunch and learn that we're doing? How do we go about structuring that? That person can be someone who can help you navigate and sometimes be the voice at the table if you can't be at the table, to influence or even say, hey, you know what, we should give this group a chance. And last but not least, I think the thing that's passionate for me, and I need employees to always know that they always have a choice. So if you have tried everything that you can within your organization, you've educated yourself, you've done all the things that you think you can do, and the organization still doesn't want to move, then you've got to reassess what's important to you. Is this the right organization for you? And if it is, then you continue to fight the fight. But if it's not, then you need to explore options of organizations that can align with the values that you have. Because sometimes organizations are like, they're like green avocados. If you cut them before they are ripe, it's a hard process to get back to a place where all of a sudden it doesn't ripen on its own again. You have to toss that avocado out and then bring it back and get a new one and wait for it to ripen before you can cut it again. So I would say to folks, really assess where your organization is at, but start with yourself. And once you start with yourself and you become educated and you start doing the work, then you can figure out what is the issue or initiative you want to champion. Maybe I'll turn it over to you, Al. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, completely spot on, completely agree, right? I think I'm sitting here nodding my head because I'm like, yes, completely agree here. And I think the point around employee appetite and finding the right resources to help you with this, I think, is a really critical point. When we started our employee resource groups at Robert Half, they were all grassroots employee-led initiatives. We had employees that were very passionate about this, that said, this matters and this is important to us. And then they went ahead and started asking the questions of, how do I get an executive sponsor? How do I start to get that level of support? And so there's a lot to be said around the power of the employee in really helping to determine the work in this space, because a lot of times we tend to kind of come into it and thinking, here comes Big Brother, and we're coming in and we're going to analyze and say, this is where we think the entry point is. We might be completely wrong, right? Because we might not have a true sense of what employees are really looking for and what the change is that they're looking to drive. So, to whatever extent your employees do raise that passion and raise that, they want to put in the work. And so how do we enable them to be able to do that? And if it's not the right time, then how are we honest with them to say, we love where you're going, but it's not the right time for X, Y, and Z reasons, but we want to continue this conversation with you at another point in time, so that at least we're setting the right expectations. Because I think those employees, in absence of that information, will continue to go down paths. And then to your point, Giselle, will become frustrated and then start to question, well, why the heck am I pushing this rock up this mountain by myself if no one is willing to help me with it? That's not the image that we're trying to create or the culture that we're trying to create. So we have to be very cognizant of ensuring that we have that honesty and transparency with folks to be able to help us in that respect.
Yeah, just to feed off that point, I remember one executive from another firm was saying to me that, sometimes you have to, as an executive, you have to be willing to tell people, hey, you know what? That's not the path that we're on. We are going to do A and B. We can't do everything in the alphabet. But I sometimes feel that those conversations are difficult for executives because they don't want to tell employees, oh, we don't care about DE&I, because that's how it comes across.
Right.
So they're not sure how to say yes, but they're not sure how to say, not that right now, but let's focus on this other thing. So I think the language that's happening within organizations needs to be one where folks can have some more authentic conversations about this, because it's a hard issue to bring up. As you said earlier, Alf, it is so emotional. It is an emotional connection to an issue that drives people to want to represent, to want to be allies, to want to be associated with different topics. So I don't know, Steph, do you have any further thoughts on this?
Do you know what? I'm going to reiterate something, Giselle, that you talked about. And honestly, I think people skip this in their journey. They go straight to the organization and say the organization needs to do something, the policies need to change, but yet don't do their own self-work. And you cannot get to the next step unless you've done your own self-work on this. So the other thing I will say, and I wanted to give an example of the power of employee resource groups in our organization. We have a caregivers plus allies ERG, and they're looking at our benefits and to sort of how to sort of support our benefits and sort of to enhance our benefits. And also our Pride Plus Allies group took a look at our dress code policy. So these are two sort of tangible systemic things that the power of employee resource groups can do, besides that powerful networking, which I think sometimes executives think, oh, are you just having like a chat, a glass of wine and some cheese and whatnot? But I constantly say being able to know a person in finance when I don't work with somebody in finance and meeting them through an employee resource group makes me more productive as an employee, because now I know who to go to and to get things done. So that's super powerful.
Absolutely.
I feel like we're off tangent. I'm gonna
and I'm gonna rein it in, but it is such a powerful discussion, and I'm still stuck on that analogy of Giselle's avocado, because I love avocados.
Bananas.
So,
I heard bananas. You need to ripen them with bananas. Apparently, I haven't tested it out. I'll let everyone know.
I might have to use that one in the future. Appreciate that. But no, I think the grassroots momentum is just so powerful. I think that's ultimately what drives change instead of it coming from up, which is sometimes where things fail, right? So I'm going to stay with you, Stephanie. What would you say some of those tangible ways that organizations can get started? We kind of focused on what people can do, but as an organization, if I'm a leader, if I did that self-check, and if I'm making some moves and really want to be active, where do I start?
Yeah. So there's a few different ways. One, I will say, from the education standpoint, you need ongoing education. So whether you're getting in speakers to come in, whether you're having informal conversations. So we started something called Courageous Conversations, where our employees facilitate discussions, and it's things like on privilege, allyship. And so it gives the employee an opportunity to sort of get those facilitation skills. So that is, in my mind, sort of basic, sort of ongoing. I think you need a council or a task force of champions. I think we call it the diversity task force. I think we have them from all levels of the organization, which I think is important. We don't do it at lunch. I think, unfortunately, I think lunch and learn should be stopped, because people need their lunch time and you do it on work time, I also think starting little pilots is something to sort of, you try something, you learn from it, and you expand. One sort of simple example I will give is at SAP, we had an internal sort of engineering conference that was like pretty much 85% male, 15% female speakers, and we wanted to change that. So what we did was I said, well, why don't we bring in all of our female engineers and have a conversation? So brought all the female engineers in, and I said to them, I was like, come on, your folks, you are very smart. You have lots of ideas. Why don't you pitch your idea? And so I had 2 meetings with them. I said, I am not the expert, but I can help you with the speaking, the presentation, anything like that, the stories, that kind of thing. We literally went from like 15% to 40%. And I had 2 meetings with them to apply. This is just a small little example, but this is how change starts to happen, right? Mm-hmm. And then I've got to do not do this. Do not read the top 3 HBR articles. No offense to HBR, because they feel like the top 3 is going to save you. You just need to do the top 3 things for diversity, the top 3 for inclusion. I fall for it every time and then get annoyed halfway through the article. So back to that conversation of know your values and what you stand for as an organization. Alf, Giselle, jump on in, please.
I mean, talk about flavor of the month, right? That's the quickest way to be able to kind of get to that place, right? And then the next thing you know, here we are chasing the shiny objects in that respect accordingly, right? And I think that's what we're trying to avoid. But, you know, the other thing that I think is important as you think about, like, where do I even start? How do I even get started on this journey? It really is listening and understanding your organization. And this is really an opportunity where you can listen not only to what your executives have to say about it, but what do your employees want in this space, especially your newer employees that are joining the organization, where, as we mentioned earlier, this is becoming a bigger priority and a bigger sense of importance for them as well. So is it about creating connection? Is it about ensuring equity? And then using those as opportunities to really be able to determine where the entry point is for programs. You know, in addition, we also at Robert Half, we do exit surveys with our people. And so we try to understand, well, why are people leaving us, especially people that are from underrepresented groups? What was it about the experience that we need to think about? Is it we didn't develop you enough? Is it you felt like you didn't belong? And so there's a lot of data that exists out there if you know how to look for it and you know how to bring it all together. And then it gives us the opportunity to not only look at the programs that are traditionally DEI programs, but to really look at all aspects of the experience to weave in DEI. One of the things that we're working on now is reinventing our performance and succession process. And so how do we weave DEI into a process that everybody experiences so that we don't get into a situation that I've seen at other companies where 10% of your population are Black employees, but 40% of the lowest rated employees are Black employees, right? It begs the question, what's happening here, right? And so this is where we really want to be able to pull that thread across the board. So it doesn't have to be about launching ERGs and launching massive training and doing all of that. It is something as simple as being intentional in how does the DEI lens apply to how we hire, how we promote, how we grow, how we reward. That could very well be a good entry point for people to consider as well, because it's things that people are already used to. And so you give it to them in a way that feels safe, that feels aligned. And then it gives you the opportunity to kind of do what I like to call the baby steps, right? Let me take you to this first place and then feel comfortable there. And then let me take you to the second place. And it may take me, 10 rounds of baby steps, but I'm going to get you to the end game versus just pulling you and making you come with me right out the gate, because we all know that that's where the resistance is going to come through.
I like what you hit on, Alfred, because Fredo, I think one of the things that I often have seen us struggle with is collecting data. Mm-hmm. If you don't have a proper system for collecting data, if you start or when you start, employees need to know the purpose and the rationale behind it, because there's already a distrust. Wait a second, why do you want to know whether or not I identify one way or the other? Why do you want to know what my ethnicity is? What value does that add? And some organizations feel that, well, we've had these employees, they know our intentions, but they're not explicit enough about why they're collecting the data and how they plan to use the data. And with marketing and communications, you can't tell that message once. You've got to tell it 10 different times, 10 different ways to reinforce that this is something that's going to add value to the employee's experience. But data is a big piece. And one of the things that you sometimes look at is how do you collect that in a way that doesn't help the vulnerable population feel even more vulnerable and feel more exposed? So that's an area that I think it's still a question mark for some.
Agreed. And this is where honesty and transparency becomes so critical in this space, right? The fact, if we are asking you to self-identify, if we are asking to get this information, why are we asking for it? What are we going to use this data? Who's going to see this data? How does it impact our programs? And then we also have to be able to actually demonstrate that we're doing something with that data, right? And I think that's the other piece, right? We fall victim to this with employee surveys, with any sort of a listening approach, is we go and we gather this data and then we have analysis paralysis and then we don't do anything with it, right? That's the piece where we're really going to build trust with our employees, is to say, I'm asking you for this. Now I'm actually let me show you what I'm going to do with this and how I'm going to better the experience accordingly in order to build that sense of trust, so that they keep giving us that information so that we can keep on moving down this path together. So that's such a great point, Giselle.
Yeah, and I also, just to feed off of that, I read something recently about DEI apathy. It's almost like survey apathy, where people are just tired of it because they have all of these initiatives that are going and they don't often see it going anywhere, or the organization does a whole bunch of good stuff but does not tie it back in to the data it's collected. So to organizations or leaders that are on the call, be aware of the fact that one of the important pieces is, when you do the stuff that employees are asking for in these surveys, you need to connect it back to where you got the information and the why. You always have to make the connection points. Don't assume because we're doing this action, people are automatically going to make the connection. Oh, it's because of that DEI survey that I did. No, they will not. You've got to reinforce that point. Yeah.
And update, I think, right? Like on a regular basis, be updating at least monthly. It has to be talked about in multiple different formats.
Yeah. For sure, for sure.
Okay, I'm going to pull it back. I'm going to pull it back. We're going to go down a rabbit hole on this one. I want to weave in a couple of questions from the audience. I think that will be critical, and then we'll jump back to a couple of other questions. But I think this is a good one that was posed. What could be the best strategy when you have a situation in a workplace that you don't feel supported in the space, and maybe you don't have that HR professional that you can go to in the company? Any of you, if you want to jump in and maybe share with me, what do you do in that situation?
Wow, that's a tough one. I would say that when you don't have HR, or you have HR that you don't trust, that can be a tough place. However, there's always someone in the organization that you can talk to. I believe that everybody always has a go-to friend or ally that they can bounce the idea off. And sometimes when you are as close to an issue, you sometimes can lose perspective. So by talking to someone else who is not involved in the issue, they can shed different perspective and may be able to give you some tips on, okay, you know what? I heard about this before, or I know someone who can help us, and they may be able to bring someone into that conversation that can help move it from the paralysis that you feel that you can't do anything to being able to put in a perspective where you can probably start taking some action towards either resolving it or getting it rectified.
Great suggestion there. Another question that came into the box here, when it comes to DEI, how does that maybe compare to other individuals with disabilities, including someone that maybe has autism?
I mean, I think the disability space is an incredibly important component of the DEI equation. I think that we historically will focus on gender and race and ethnicity because there are a lot of regulatory reasons to kind of move into that space, right? And that becomes foundational for people. But, you know, we should be looking at spectrums across age, sexual orientation, gender identity, military status, disability, both physical and cognitive, right? And I think that I think this is becoming much more of a priority for organizations. I know at Robert Half, you know, we've been engaging with external strategic partners. We have a global partnership with Disability In for us to really start to assess our disability practices and to think about how do we best attract employees from that particular group. The other piece, though, that I think is really important in this overall DEI quest, and I think this is a way to get the majority involved in this space, is yes, we tend to focus on characteristics, but diversity is something as simple as, you know, if you have a group of 10 white males, how many of you grew up in a large city and how many of you grew up in a small town? How many of you might speak with a regional accent versus others? How many of you went to a large public university versus a small private one? all of those pieces, right, are these aspects of this diversity of thought that are really, really important. And so as we look to bring in other characteristics, there's other ways for us to be able to kind of set the stage for folks so that they understand that it doesn't have to be so myopic on a respective characteristic, but that there's room for other characteristics to come together in order to really create that culture of belonging that we're looking to create.
That's so great, Alva. I will just add the one thing to when you are thinking about disability is you have to also think of the environment, right? Like at SAP, when we created our Autism at Work program, we started off with small groups and we had managers who were open to this and whatnot, because we did not want to be putting anybody who was neurodiverse in a team that might not be potentially have the understanding and whatnot, right? And so you definitely want to be looking at teams that are potentially, more inclusive or more open and have the education to do this. But I do think also from a legislation standpoint, with the legislation around accessibility coming into Canada in particular, there will be more and more for sure. So we currently are sort of going through the process of creating a separate accessibility strategy, because the topic around accessibility is so much bigger than just a general EDI strategy, but ties in.
Yeah. And, I think as able-bodied folks, sometimes we don't realize how many disadvantages there are for folks that are not able-bodied. I was having a discussion with one of our senior salespeople, and he has a very close friend who is disabled. And one of the things that he has had he oriented me to was he's gone in many places where he's had to take his buddy out of the wheelchair and take him into the washroom because the washroom wasn't accessible. And this is not in a rural town. This is in a downtown metropolitan city. So it's one of those things where I think if you're not aware, you don't even know, you lose line of sight of anything that is not within your periphery. So I will say that education is going to be a big part of this as well. Just trying to figure out what it is you don't know, because the lens we have has been formulated over time through our experiences but it's not the only way to look at the world. So educating ourselves and getting ourselves informed is a big part of, creating the space for difference.
That's fabulous. Some great pointers in there. Just as a starting point for many organizations, what would you recommend as an assessment point? I think both you mentioned, or I think Stephanie and Giselle mentioned one of those assessments or programs, but anything else out there that you would recommend personally?
I'm a big fan of DEI maturity models. So Korn Ferry and some of the large HR type of consulting organizations, diversity best practices, some of those big groups, create a maturity model where you can actually assess where you are in the DEI journey. And it kind of gives you that understanding of the entry points where you might be able to come into play. I also agree with Giselle and Steph, right? Anytime that you can find an external partner to help you and guide you through this journey. We all know that DEI takes a village. And so let's bring in the right villagers to help us really drive this work. And so there's a lot to be said around bringing in that perspective. We have external strategic partnerships with about 15 different organizations to help us think through specific issues across the dimensions of diversity. And so getting that perspective and that practice is great, but finding one of those maturity models or self-assessments is a really good way to at least start to get a sense of your current state so that you then at least know where you might be able to go from there.
Yeah, we also we all know, though, community partnerships does cost money, and we all know that this space is probably under-resourced. So there's also the Global Diversity, Inclusion, Equity benchmarks that we have used, where we've taken it and put it into a survey tool to ask our employees to see where they're at, which gives us a little bit similar to you probably, Alf, around the maturity model. So that's also another place to kind of take a look.
I would concur with all of you. I think at the end of the day, data is going to be important to be able to collect and assess. And sometimes if you don't know where to start by talking to people in your network. I mean, we have social media platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, Snapchat, everywhere else, and Instagram. Why don't you reach out to the people in your network and say, hey, trying to do this. Can you help me find a free resource? And that's going to be, think of all your followers. All of those people have touched somebody else who may know something about this. Yeah. And that can be the feed of information for you to start your research.
Those are great, great resources. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you all for the incredibly insightful conversation. I believe that many are looking for ways to make the EIS part of what they do professionally as leaders and as individuals. So to our panelists, I'm really grateful for your openness today, for sharing your challenges, some of your wins, and giving us some tangible examples that and best practices to start somewhere or maybe even continue your journey. So bottom of my heart and Robert Half, take care everyone and enjoy the rest of your day.
Same to you, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, take care.
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.